Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Family Business Planning and U.S. Expansion. My name is Sarah Larson. I'm the Marketing Manager here at Invest Buffalo Niagara, the Buffalo Niagara Region's Economic Development Organization. If you have attended a past webinar or you receive a monthly Canadian business newsletter, you've been introduced to Carolyn Powell, who is our Invest Buffalo Niagara International Business Development Director. She works with Canadian businesses considering an expansion to our region. And when you visit Buffalo Niagara, Carolyn introduces you to a variety of local partners who will be able to assist you during your expansion process. Two of those partners to potentially be introduced to have joined me today for this presentation, Scott Friedman and Tom Keable, both with local law firm Lippis, MATHIAS, WEXLER, Friedman. Scott and Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box at your GoToWebinar control panel. We will take time for questions at the end. Following this presentation, you will receive an email with a link to Carolyn's calendar if you wish to schedule a conversation with her. We will also make sure you have both of our guides to Canadian business expansion. But today we'll speak with legal experts Scott and Tom. And without further ado, we're going to jump right in with Scott and talk about family business planning. So Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. Really looking forward to our conversation.
When Canadian businesses expand to the U.S., they do so for a variety of reasons, as Carolyn has noted in our previous webinars. But our focus today is one particular reason for expanding here. It's part of your Canadian family business plan. So Scott, let's start by looking at some family business statistics, because most of businesses globally really are family owned, and owners nowadays don't just have a son to consider growing into the business, but an increasing number of leadership teams include a daughter or maybe even a daughter-in-law, grandchild. So let's take a look at some of these stats.
Yeah, so it's interesting. With respect to statistics, it probably becomes important to first understand what is meant by a family business. And there are a lot of ways people might define what a family business is, but sort of a typical definition is a business where decision-making control rests with a founder or his or her spouse, parents, children, or heirs. So using that definition, family businesses could be very small mom and pop businesses or some of the largest, best known businesses in the world, such as Walmart or Ford Motor Company or BMW. Again, with that definition of a family business, most businesses in the United States and Canada, around the world, are family owned. In Canada, family businesses are responsible for about 60% of Canadian GDP and the largest producers of new jobs. Family businesses continue to grow, and as you said just a moment ago, increasingly, and not surprisingly, women are representing more and more top management positions in family businesses. Notwithstanding their importance to culture and economies, family businesses are challenging. And it's actually quite tragic when family businesses fail, and they usually do. Although a couple things about that. First of all, the statistics around failure are imprecise. Family businesses are private, and decisions to dissolve or sell a business are often known only to family members and their confidential advisors, lawyers and accountants and other advisors. And so the reasons for a family business being sold or shutting down are not necessarily, and they're typically not known to the public. And there also could be a lot of reasons why family businesses don't transition from one generation to the next, such as there's an opportunity to sell at a very attractive profit, or a family may not have any successor, a child interested in working in the business. So there are a number of reasons why family businesses may not make it from the first generation to the second or third generation. But having said that, we do know that most family businesses don't last very long, and that there are a lot of family businesses that struggle because of very sad family dynamics and family relationships. So some statistics around that: most family businesses fail within the first 10 years of operations. Only 3 out of 10 family businesses make it from the first generation to the second generation. Only 1 out of 10 makes it from the first generation to the grandchild's generation. So they're tough businesses to run, because aside from just competing in the world with every other business, innovations, competition, changing tax laws, and other rules and regulations that every business faces, families face peculiar and unique dynamics that public companies don't face because of family dynamic issues.
And then we know our stats, show that a number of family businesses expect that the owner will retire in the next decade, and many of them haven't chosen a successor. So let's take a look at our next slide. We know that we have some very successful businesses in Buffalo Niagara that are family run, and transitioning even now into their third generation. But for a high percentage of those who don't transition to the next generation, let's talk a little bit about why.
Well, it's interesting, and again, recognizing that the why can be a bit imprecise, we know increasingly through surveys and studies that what was typically thought of the reason why most families don't make it is poor estate planning and poor tax planning. But we've come to better appreciate over the years that, in fact, most failures are due to intra-family mistrust and miscommunication. Mistrust doesn't happen typically in one day or 1 week or even 1 year, but happens over time because roles and responsibilities aren't clear, plans and policies about how decisions are to be made aren't well defined and adhered to in a sort of committed way. Families take trust for granted, and it turns out from these surveys that have been done in recent years that a lot of the family businesses that we know are sold because of failures, in the sense that it was a good business that families could have continued, fail not because of poor estate and tax planning, but because of miscommunication and lack of trust and lack of planning. And only about 5% or so fail because they didn't do the right estate tax planning. So over time, in the work that Tom and I and some of our colleagues have done, we've thought about what else could we do to help families understand the risks that they face. It would include, estate taxes and transfer taxes, but beyond that, the bigger issues are: how do you understand trust, or how is mistrust created? So part of our modeling is reflected in the chart that's up on the screen right now, reflects on 2 axes, trust being measured over time. And what this is intended to show is that families typically start with very high trust. Who would one rather work with than their parents or their children or brothers and sisters? But over time, we know that trust erodes, and we believe it erodes because relationships are taken for granted. People wind up in jobs because it's convenient, it's lucrative, it's expected, not necessarily because it's a good fit based on one's experience or interests or aptitude. Families don't often have ground rules for communication. Meetings are ad hoc and unscheduled, and little things like people, texting or emailing during a conversation, nonverbal communications like slouching over, not looking interested in what someone else has to say, can create challenging communication dynamics. Unprincipled decisions around things like compensation and decisions to expand or contract and how to compete, to small decisions about what vendors to use for supplies, can be made in sort of ad hoc, random ways that appear to be inconsistent and unprincipled, and that inconsistency can create further mistrust. And then finally, a lot of families are reluctant to include outside advisors around their table and to get objective third-party perspectives on what decisions should be made or not. So in the aggregate, taking all those factors together over time, it's easy to see where trust can erode, and what started off as a great relationship between parents, children, siblings, erodes so that there's conflict and often litigation, and from the business perspective, a need to sell or shut down, and the business has failed and becomes one of those statistics.
Right. So communication being so important in any business, but I think the key element I'm taking away from what you're saying is when it's a family business, we often take it for granted. And not only does that problem affect the family within the business, or they take that home personally, but it also trickles down to the next 2 slides, looking at how a negative workplace culture affects the entire business. Versus then we'll take a look at what businesses who are putting the time and energy into creating a positive work culture are experiencing.
Yeah, this is particularly interesting, and really kind of the focal point of the work that we do around family businesses, taking sort of traditional plans and insights, but layering on top of all that, continually developing insights from science, fields like social neuroscience, behavioral economics, positive psychology. And we know from neuroscience that our brains are hardwired from millions of years of evolution to make very quick decisions as opposed to thoughtful decisions, because of this innate fight or flight instinct that we have, that years ago helped our ancestors survive in a much more dangerous world than we live in right now. Our fight or flight instinct causes us to react in modern day forms of fear-based behavior, and fighting comes out when we focus on negative feedback or criticism that we tend to take personally. And so behaviors like greediness, anger, protecting your turf, even lying are examples, sort of modern day forms of fear-based behavior, as opposed to, again, as our brains evolved to overcome the sort of base instincts with higher order thinking, the kinds of thought processes that lead to empathy, compassion, forgiveness, understanding, love between family members and colleagues. So in a fear-based environment where culture hasn't been focused on, that spins off into very negative economic effects, bottom line effects. It's sort of the most interesting aspect of work around the intersection between neuroscience and business, in my view. What used to be the soft stuff, the qualitative stuff, is now being quantitatively measured, and we know that employees who work in negative cultures are less committed, they're less productive, they take frustrations out on their customers. The costs to business are measured. Gallup recently measured the cost of negative culture upwards of $600 billion a year. Now, by contrast, there's for as much work that has been done around the bottom line effects of negative cultures, there's sort of the correlation, the work that's been done around positive workplace culture and the bottom line effects in business when culture is really supportive, positive, and where people are allowed to flourish. There are great books on the subject and courses that are being taught now at places like Harvard and Yale on happiness. For any of the listeners, perhaps the Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker, who taught happiness at Harvard for years, might be a great starting place. I might say what's interesting about this work is that it's might often be consistent with insights from religion or philosophy or even pop psychology. Positive psychology it's a science, so it's based on scientific studies and getting empirical data. The empirical data is that when employees work in an environment where there's trust, where there's loyalty, where there's respect, there is more energy, there's more productivity, there's more creativity, and its bottom line is there are higher sales and more successful businesses.
I know here when we get around to different companies and visit our local businesses, we see some really unique, not only implementations of how they might deal with their workforce, but also workspaces. So I know positive work culture is definitely a hot topic. So let's talk about what success looks like for family businesses. Positive work culture, good communication, a plan that includes not only financial or legal planning, but people planning.
Yeah, going back to the last comments I made, the people planning includes intentional efforts to create culture where people feel safe, where they feel comfortable, where they feel like they're being respected and rewarded, treated fairly. So in our work, we spend a lot of time thinking about culture, having codes of conduct about how to talk to people, when to put your phone down, and body language, nonverbal communication, like the important places like Stanford University and Yale are focusing on the correlation between smiling and tone of voice and a good conversation versus a bad conversation. So those are the sorts of things that we focus on from a cultural point of view. We focus on having constructive conversations, appreciative conversations where people are even mindful of the importance of sometimes of the ratio. This is other interesting work that's been done. The ratio of positive comments to negative comments. If the ratio of positive to negative comments is something under 6 or 7 to 1, it's a troubled relationship. So we advise our clients to be mindful of how our brains tend to focus more on criticisms and on compliments, because of how our ancestors needed to survive in a dangerous world. We focus on being clear about principles, plans, policies, how people get to be employed in the business, how they advance in the business, how they get compensated in business, whether they get even fired if they aren't performing in the business, and maybe one day become a successor because they're sort of clearly articulated succession plans about what will be required to take on that role. We also focus around job fit. Too many people get into positions because it's their family that owns the business, and families can get hung up, frankly, on titles and prestige, on compensation, versus whether a position is the right position for an individual. Probably the best advice I ever heard for family businesses on that subject was from former U.S. President Truman. Said the best advice the parent could give their kid is to help them understand what they want to do, and then go advise them to do it. And it's advice that is underused, sadly, too often. Good governance, having outside advisors, whether professionals or board members, who can offer more objective third-party perspective. And then, of course, I did not mean to dismiss the importance of a good estate plan, financial plan, and retirement plan. But the money plan without the people plan has proven not to work. So that's to us what good holistic planning looks like.
And then, of course, one solution could be considering expanding to the U.S. as part of your family business strategy and succession plan.
Yeah, so that's a particularly interesting opportunity for Canadian businesses. Notwithstanding all the planning that could be done in an ideal world, in a world where culture is positive, where decisions are made by, through clearly articulated plans and policies, and there's good governance and everything else, everything possible that could be done has been done. At the end of the day, people are still people, and relationships can be challenging. And the more family members who are around the table, the more likely it is for family members to bump into each other and disagree, whether decisions are good ones or bad ones. And so the opportunity for Canadians with family businesses to think about expanding to the U.S. is not perhaps simply a great business opportunity or great economic opportunity, but from a family business planning opportunity, it would allow one or more family members to focus on the Canadian operations and other family members to focus on operations in the U.S., giving those two or more family members space, psychological space to say, you know what, day to day, I have my own thing to focus on, and I'm not going to be getting sidetracked by disagreements with family members who have their own space to focus on.
Great. I think this would be a great time to turn our presentation over to Tom and look at an expansion to the U.S. as part of a Canadian business growth and succession plan. Tom, I know you and Carolyn have worked with companies who actually have expanded and had this part of their succession plan expanded to the U.S. And it can seem like maybe an overwhelming task, but the reality is if you have a really good plan and you're speaking and using the right professionals to help you do so, the expansion part is actually the easy part.
Yeah, I much agree with that. I think that successful Canadian businesses have already accomplished the hardest part, namely finding their niche, developing good products and services, competitively priced, creating good organizations, hiring great personnel. Compared with all that it takes to accomplish that, I think expanding to the U.S. is relatively easy.
And with your experience, you've identified 3 particular tips for our audience today: proper incorporation, taking the time to plan for success, and starting some processes early. So let's take a look at the first tip, incorporation, and the benefits of setting up a U.S. affiliation.
Sure. The starting point for analysis is often the Canada-U.S. tax treaty. And under that, a Canadian business can sell its goods and services to U.S. customers without incurring federal U.S. tax payment and reporting obligations, so long as they do not have what's known as a permanent establishment. A permanent establishment is a fixed place of business, an office, a warehouse, a manufacturing facility, but can also be as minute as a single employee, specifically an employee that has the power to sign contracts that bind the Canadian company. And if the Canadian company is going to have a permanent establishment in the U.S., there's not a requirement that they form a U.S. entity for their U.S. activities. It's just that the negative is that the Canadian company is going to have to file and pay U.S. taxes, and that then gets the company into what's known as branch accounting. They have to allocate all of their activities, their revenues, their deductions, expenses, credits as between one side of the border and the other side of the border. And I think the accountants, if any on this call, are thinking, oh my God, that's a monumental undertaking. And frankly, I've yet to meet a single accountant that likes or wants to do branch accounting. So generally, frequently, the solution is to compartmentalize the U.S. activities in a U.S. entity, which then separately reports those for tax purposes. And there are other advantages to that as well. It will tend to lessen the Canadian company's exposure if the U.S. company is properly formed, and the separateness between the Canadian and the U.S. company is respected. Generally, then the Canadian company will not have liability or exposure for the activities of the U.S. company, and that's often a significant advantage because the U.S. is rightly perceived, I believe, as very litigious, perhaps some even say a cesspool of litigation. And there are other advantages to that as well. May provide a measure of protection or against Buy American prejudices. U.S. customers may rightly, from a business standpoint, where the Canadian company's offerings are essentially of the same quality as that of their U.S. competitors, and the prices of the two offerings are about the same. Well, a customer in the U.S. is then faced with essentially a tie, and they have nothing else to break the tie other than say, well, I'm going to buy it from the American company. So I think so as to not lose the tiebreakers, we sometimes form U.S. companies for Canadian businesses really just to Americanize them and as I like to put it, put an American face on the Canadian company, and they then have a U.S. address. And the fact that their offerings are essentially Canadian does not then become part of the conversation.
Okay, tip number 2, taking the time to plan and speak with the right professionals will save time and money really in the long run.
Presence and success are interrelated. In other words, I think it's really tough for Canadian business to successfully attack and penetrate the U.S. market without coming into the U.S. physically. The only companies that I've really encountered that can do that in a big, successful way are those that can, sell on the internet and stream their offerings without needing to have a presence in the U.S. And of course, as I said earlier, if you do have that presence, the likelihood is that that's going to be a permanent establishment. And so the company is going to pick up federal U.S. tax obligations as well as state tax obligations wherever they are physically located. Sometimes there's a bit of a perception, well, let's just dip our toe in the water. We don't want to immediately form an entity. Let's do a few things and see how that goes. That's okay if that's the strategy, but sometimes it's better to really make the leap to eventually, if you're going to be successful, in most instances, I think you're going to have that presence, and it may be best to just bite the bullet, plan to be successful, form the U.S. entity, because one thing a lot of people don't think about is if you need to switch your structure down the road. In other words, initially you put all of your U.S. customers in the Canadian company. If you then down the road form a U.S. company, you have to switch over all of your customers to the new U.S. company. Additionally, if you have enough of a presence that you've incurred state obligations, such as paying state sales taxes and registering for those, then if you're not using a U.S. company, initially those are all in the Canadian company. And of course, when you do switch models, activate a U.S. company, you have to switch over all of those registrations, and it's a bit of a nuisance and expense.
Tip number 3, here are a couple tasks to think about maybe earlier on rather than later on, much like you just mentioned with incorporation.
Well, sure. I would suggest that any Canadian business that is thinking that it's ever going to go bring its offerings to the U.S. Have searches done just to confirm that the names and brand names that those are marketed under are available in the U.S. And if so, that they take the affirmative steps to register their names and marks. Those registrations can be made on an intent to use basis. In other words, generally to register a mark with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the registration will not issue until you can document that you've actually used it in the U.S. In other words, with samples of product packaging or advertisements, for instance. But an application can be made on an intent to use basis so that presently, even though you're not yet shipping to the U.S., not marketing or advertising in the U.S., you can still register your marks. And the corollaries to that is if your mark is not available, well, eventually, if you're going to come to the States, you're going to have to pick a different name or mark. And of course, that's going to entail rebranding, which is expensive and something that most companies are not thrilled about doing. But on the other hand, you don't want to come blazing into the U.S. and find that immediately the first correspondence you receive is a cease and desist letter saying that, from someone who is using a name or mark either the same or similar to that of yours, that you're infringing their rights. Or if you have the happy circumstance that your name or mark is available, lock it up and it will exclusively be yours when you come to the States.
Great advice, and I think it's an awesome taste of the knowledge that the partners that we work with here in Buffalo Niagara have, and just a sampling of it. And I think that's why the businesses that Carolyn and our partners have worked with from Canada and have expanded here have been successful doing so here. You can also visit our website at buffaloniagara.org, where you can link to Carolyn's social accounts, email address, and download our expansion guides. Carolyn's services are free of charge and confidential to any company considering an expansion into the region. She serves as a single point of contact, and she will connect you to partners like Scott and Tom and many other experts that will ensure that your expansion is a smooth one. So let's start with our first question. Looks like this might be for you, Tom. If I send a family member to Buffalo Niagara and set up an operation, how do I get them across the border?
Well, I would recommend that they not swim this time of the year. No, seriously, they are likely coming, whether they know it or not, as business visitors. In other words, they are presently coming in support of the Canadian company's U.S. activities. And a lot of people may not realize this, but much of the questioning that they encounter at the border kiosk is focused on determining whether or not a given person looking to come to the U.S. For their trip that day qualifies as a business visitor. So when you hit the border and you're asked the purpose of the trip and you say business, then they start asking questions that are designed to determine whether or not you qualify as a business visitor, with the requirements being that you're coming as an employee on behalf of a Canadian company. You are exclusively compensated in Canada. Your trip is in support of the Canadian company's U.S. activities, and your trip is of short duration, and you're returning to Canada at the end of the trip.
So if I have a Canadian family member that does move their company to the U.S., does that family member that's running that U.S. location have to move to the U.S.?
Well, no. I mean, the decision of whether they want to move to the U.S. Reside is largely a business decision. In terms of what does it take to most successfully penetrate the U.S. market and operate the U.S. activities of the Canadian company, or perhaps its new U.S. subsidiary or affiliate. Of course, if they are going to come to the U.S., they need to have some status, either as I mentioned earlier, that they're coming as a business visitor, or that they obtain a visa. And there are a number of visas that are the Canadians coming to the U.S. are likely candidates for that will work, such as an L1 intercompany transferee, an E2 a treaty investor, or E1 treaty trader, or perhaps a TN. But again, the big takeaway is you need to have some thought or give some planning to, how are they going to come to the U.S. and secure the necessary visa or qualification.
Right, so we have another question very similar to this. We've begun answering it already. Do we really need a working permit even though we're incorporating in the U.S.?
Well, it depends on the timing. I mean, initially, the trips are likely precatory in setting up the U.S. operations, forming a company, perhaps securing space, initial hiring of employees, and much of those can be done under the business visitor category. At some point, however, the world is going to change and they'll be coming on behalf of the U.S. company, and at that point they will need to obtain a more formal visa.
It sounds difficult, but I know you and Carolyn deal with this every day. Switching over a little bit, Scott, how do you see the percentage of ownership among a company playing a role in decision making for a family business?
Well, I think that there are sort of two aspects to that. One is with respect to percentages, and on some level it's as simple as who has 51% or more of the voting control of a company, and that sort of then becomes a legal basis for making a decision. On another level, and this again sort of speaks to the opportunity for Canadian family businesses to explore the possibility of moving to the United States here in Western New York, because it's so close to the border. It goes back to the earlier comment I made about giving people space to participate in a business, to help run and operate a business without feeling like every move, every action, every decision is being watched over by big brother, big sister, or mom and dad. So from a numbers point of view, more numbers of family members in a business, the more interesting it becomes to think about expanding to the U.S.
We have one more question we want to tackle here, Tom. If our Canadian business has multiple family members owning it, and then we expand to the U.S., who owns that U.S. corporation?
Well, it's a terrific question, but unfortunately it's a big question. We would want to take a look at the present ownership structure of the Canadian company, and then we'd want to think about, are each of the present shareholder owners to participate in the same relative percentages in the U.S. activities? If the plan is for this to be a bit of space, as Scott was saying earlier, for one or a couple of the family members, then they may appropriately want to have a bigger percentage ownership. And then we also have to consider a number of things in just structuring the ownership. In other words, it's typically best not to just put a U.S. operating company under the ownership of a Canadian operating company. The U.S. company shares then become an asset of the Canadian company. Secondly, if you put the U.S. company under the ownership of the Canadian operating company, that can be a negative from a flexibility standpoint. In other words, if there comes a time that they want to sell one company but not the other, but one owns the other, then you may need to do what we call a spin out of the one company from under the ownership of the other. And typically that's a bit of an expense and perhaps a tax hit. And then there is, lastly, a Canadian side tax consideration, and that is if your Canadian company is a CCPC, a small business corporation that's a Canadian-controlled private company, as you know, many of the people on are hearing this webinar may know, shareholders of a CCPC are entitled to a one-time capital gains exclusion of the first $800,000 when they sell their CCPC shares. And at the Canadian marginal tax rates, that works out to be about a $300,000 tax savings, which is really terrific and juicy and lucrative if you're selling your CCPC shares. Well, if the CCPC owns a U.S. company and the U.S. company grows to the point that it is more than 50% of the value of the two, then your CCPC status and qualification is lost.
Great information. And more information and questions that if you have, Carolyn and Scott and Tom will be able to help you with if you reach out. Looks like we've covered all of our questions, and if we've missed any, we will make sure that we answer them for you in a reply email. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join our webinar today, and especially Scott and Tom, thank you so much for your time and your professional knowledge for this presentation. Your emails are also on the screen for our audience to see today, and they're welcome to reach out to you directly too with more questions.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun, and anyone who wants to follow up on any of the points is welcome to come back to us on an email.
Yes, Sarah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, guys.